You can make all of the plans in the world to reinvent your personal brand, but they aren't going to work if you don't address a few key things. Grab your cup of tea and let's dive into it. Reinventing your personal brand isn't all about the glossy exterior. It's not just about the clothes that you wear, the colors that you choose, the fonts that you pick, or updating your LinkedIn profile. It starts with your identity. And often it's not addressing this aspect that can be the reason why so many people struggle to reinvent their personal brand, because the person that they want to become isn't matching the person that they have already been, and they're not sure how to address that. So today I want to dive into some of the key things that are worth thinking about before you set out to reinvent your personal brand. Number one is that you could be holding on to past identities. So this might be, for example, a previous role that you had, a title, a workplace that you worked for a while back, or a peer group that you were a part of, for example, or certain networks. You might feel like you are defined by those experiences, particularly the ones that you were most successful in. It is hard to move on from those experiences when they have so often defined who you were in your past identity. But what I would challenge you to think about is how much that is now contributing to the direction that you are going in moving forward. Sometimes hanging on to the identities that you had in roles that may have felt like the most exciting roles that you had in your career is what is going to hold you back from moving forward. So ask yourself if you are hanging on to those things. And a lot of the time, it's those identities that prevent us from exploring all of the exciting potential that could also lie ahead in your future as well. And sometimes this has to do with the expectations of the people that were a part of those past experiences. For example, longtime friends or peers or former colleagues have a certain idea of you. They have your perception of your personal brand, your identity, your personality in a predefined box. And when you start to color outside of that box, that can be confusing for them. They want you to stay potentially in this box that they have created. That's why they sometimes ask you the questions that they do. They can't understand what it is that you are doing compared to what you've done previously. And it's not just other people's perceptions that can sometimes hold us back as well. It can be our own subconscious mind that is holding us back. There is this concept that always resonated with me when I learnt more about NLP, neuro-linguistics programming. And it was this idea of secondary gain, which is something that is also understood in the health industry. It is the idea that consciously or subconsciously, there is a gain to certain behaviors. So even when you think a particular circumstance is negative and you continue to have that mind frame, there is actually sometimes a benefit that you get out of keeping yourself in that position. For example, if I tell myself that I am terrible at tech, which I did for many, many years, that means that I don't have to put in the effort to actually learn new technologies, to be that person. And what I have found in my career is that when you are that person who is saying things like that, or you're working with other people who are, it means that that job just gets delegated to someone else. And so that can be a more convenient scenario for you. So rather than putting yourself in that uncomfortable position and learning new behaviors, you stick in that comfort zone that you are in. So rebranding yourself is often going to be about leaving that comfort zone and actually challenging yourself to do new things, doing things where potentially you otherwise had a secondary gain to not do. This could be, for example, if you tell yourself that you aren't a public speaker and that you fear public speaking and that it's definitely something that you couldn't do. By doing that, that means that you don't have to put in the work that goes into public speaking. That is the secondary gain that I know that I noticed when I had that belief about myself that I was gaining. It meant that I didn't need to put myself out there in that situation or put in all of the work that is required for that. So when I was able to overcome that fear, I really changed my outlook on how I was able to build my personal brand in the public speaking space. which actually leads nicely into the point number 2 that I want to make. And that is something that also has been one of my biggest takeaways from neurolinguistics programming. And that is the idea of limiting decisions. So, neurolinguistics programming, NLP, highlights that a limiting belief is actually caused by a limiting decision. This means that the limiting belief that you have about yourself was preceded by a limiting decision. So you made the decision to have that belief. And usually that decision is made because of an event or multiple events that happened that caused you to make that decision, leading to that belief. So it is really important to revisit some of your history and go back to that event or those events and identify when it was that you made that decision. That was one of my big takeaways in NLP. It's when you're feeling a limiting belief to ask yourself the question, when did I make that decision? And then what you'll also find is that you're able to provide proof for yourself about how you've already proved that limiting belief wrong. So if I go back to the limiting belief that I once had, that I'm terrible at tech, I could pinpoint that this probably comes down to the one and only D that I got through my schooling, and that was in computing. Now, I actually know that I'm not actually bad at computing, and this actually had a lot more to do with the class that I was in and maybe how much attention I was paying in that class. But from then onwards, I just assumed that I was terrible at tech. I just took on that identity that getting that D gave me. But when I did this exercise, I was able to see how I have already proved that belief that I had about being terrible at tech wrong. For example, in my career, I have headed up digital teams. I have built websites. I have done all things digital. And yet I still had that belief that I was terrible at tech until I spent time rewriting that narrative and proving myself wrong with what I had already achieved. And the second that I actually spent time rewriting that limiting belief, it actually just took my interest in tech to a whole new level. So whatever it is that you perhaps have some limiting beliefs around, make sure that you're revisiting where that came from and how you've already proved yourself wrong in that space so that you can take your potential to the next level without being held back by those limiting beliefs. The third point that I wanted to highlight that could potentially hold you back from the potential of your rebrand is that you aren't fully embodying your rebrand. And this idea of fully embodying identities really stood out to me when I read Robin Sharma's book, The Everyday Hero Manifesto. And in the book, he highlights a social psychology study that was done with men in their 80s. And the participants were transported into, I guess, like a time capsule in which they were brought into this setup where it was designed to look like their lives had been 20 years prior, 20 plus years prior. So the books that they would have had at the time, the magazines, the music, for example. And this was a study that was actually conducted by a Harvard professor, Ellen Langer, who is known as the mother of positive psychology. And in that study, after 5 days, some key biomarkers were tested in the men. And after 5 days of these participants being in this environment, the biomarkers showed that this experience actually improved a lot of their physical attributes as well. So they looked younger, they were physically more supple, they had better dexterity and better eyesight. So for me, this really showed just how capable your brain is of rewiring itself based on your surroundings. And that is what I would encourage you to think about when it comes to your personal brand is don't just think about your current title, your current job, or the next role that you want, but actually think bigger picture about that person that you want to be and how you can fully embody who that person is. As I talk about on this channel a lot, I love to use Pinterest to explore ideas and inspiration for all aspects of my life. So if you are interested in exploring more of how you can evolve your identity and ideas in this space, then check out my previous episode on how I rewire my brain to upgrade my life using Pinterest. And point number 4 that I want to make is potentially going to be an unpopular opinion with some people, but it's one that I feel has the potential to hold you back in your rebrand and some of the plans that you make for yourself. And that is that you are overrating imposter syndrome and authenticity. Now, I know that authenticity is all the buzz when it comes to discussing all things personal branding. And Merriam-Webster, for example, even named it the 2023 word of the year because we were thinking about it, writing about it, aspiring to it, and judging it more than ever. But as I've shared on this channel before, I do believe that sometimes authenticity can be problematic because it holds you back from the potential that you have to explore new things. And I don't believe that when you think about this logically, that this is all that crazy an idea. For example, if you are a CEO or an executive and you decide that you really, really don't love public speaking, then that simply isn't going to fly in most executive positions. It's just a nature of the role that there is that requirement. So while it might not feel authentic to you to embrace public speaking, it's something that you are going to need to do to succeed in that role. Or if you take another example, I'm going to assume that an introvert, for example, who gets their energy from being alone as opposed to being with other people, maybe doesn't often love the open plan offices that have become so popular, or attending back-to-back meetings, for example. And even though it might not align to their authentic selves, because they need to do that to excel in their jobs and be accepted into certain workplaces, they put their authenticity aside to be able to grow in other areas. And this also reminds me of Dr. Carol Dweck's work on a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset. So a fixed mindset, for example, believes that your talent is natural, that it's inherited, for example, that you can't necessarily change your circumstances. Whereas a growth mindset believes that your skills and talents can be learned over time and that any setbacks are just temporary. So why I think it's valuable to think outside authenticity is not because you want to be deceitful or unethical, but because you want to challenge your predefined notions of what you think is possible and your current comfort zone. So while your current comfort zone might be authentic, it could be keeping you back from the potential that you have on the other side of that comfort zone. So in the end, your authenticity could still be things that are within you, but this untapped potential that you haven't yet brought out of yourself. And I think Brianna West in her book, The Pivot Year, said it best when she said, "You are meant to grow as new evidence and experiences are presented to you. As you adopt to new ideas, solve new problems, gain new skills, hear new perspectives, and see more of the world as it really is." And neuroscience really supports this idea, particularly in recent years. It has proved just how adaptable the brain is. It can rewire itself, and that is what we have seen through neuroplasticity. So while the version of yourself that you are creating may not necessarily at first feel authentic, you are developing the neural pathways that are going to mean that you eventually are able to embody that new version of yourself. And I really love this second quote from Brianna West as well, where she says, "Losing yourself is not always a bad thing. The point is to lose some versions of yourself. The point is to let some parts of yourself disintegrate within the fire of your personal transformation." Thanks so much. For more on rebranding yourself, then check out my previous episodes on this topic. I'll see you in the next episode.